March 31st, 1922. That night, in a quiet, lonely farm in Bavaria, 6 people were murdered. 102 years later, and we are no closer to knowing who is the person behind these heinous acts. This is the Hinterkaifeck murders. Alright, let's rewind back to a couple months prior. Hinterkaifeck is a small farmhouse in a pretty rural part of Germany, and inside this farm lives 6 people. Andreas Gruber, his wife Cecilia Gruber, their daughter Victoria Gabriel, Victoria's children who was named Cecilia, and Joseph, both of which were fathered by a man named Karl Gabriel, who died in World War I prior to the incident. And finally, the maid of the house, Maria Baumgartner, and this took place in a farm which was extremely isolated, which made it all the weirder when random noises started to be heard. 6 months before any of the attacks, one of the maids of the house was trying to sleep when she couldn't shake the thought of hearing footsteps coming from the attic, and despite initially writing it off as a figment of her imagination, eventually she just told the head of the house, Andreas, to go check on what was going on up there. But when Andreas went up to see if anything was in the attic, he could not find anyone or anything that would seem out of the ordinary, and told the maid she was just tripping balls and needed to go back to sleep. But despite that, every night when the maid would be trying to go to bed, she kept hearing things and couldn't shake the thought of feeling like someone was lurking above her. This happened so much she believed the house was haunted and eventually quit her job and peaced out. And just like the maid with the footsteps, the rest of the family soon started to find weird things happen around the house. At first it was little things that most people could chalk up to just being forgetful. One example was keys around the house going missing, which if we're being realistic, this really could have nothing to do with a mysterious murderer, and it really was just the family losing the keys. But then more ominous things started to happen. One time when Andreas stepped out of his front door, he looked down to see a newspaper from Munich, which is 40 miles away from the Hinterkaifeck farm. That's weird, he thought, probably in Bavarian, because nobody in his own family had subscribed to any newspapers, but Andreas was not too worried about it, and just chalked it up to the postman mistakenly delivering the wrong newspaper to the wrong house. As time went on though, the events around the house started to seem more and more deliberate, the most alarming of which was when, a week before the murders, Andreas found a set of footprints leading from the woods behind the house to the shed of the Gruber's home with a now broken lock, and no footprints leading back into the woods. And to this, Andreas thought, whatever. Now I get that hindsight is 2020, and Andreas had no idea what was about to happen to him or his family. But how do you see an unknown pair of footprints leading from the woods directly to the back of your house and not get alarmed? If I was in Andreas' shoes, I'd call the police and camp out in a Motel 6 until everything got figured out, but to each their own. Anyway, it was also around this time that the rest of the family heard those same footsteps in the attic, but every time Andreas would go up to check what was happening, he would always find nothing out of the ordinary. At around 4:30 on March 31st, a new maid called Maria Baumgartner showed up with her sister to replace the previous maid who had quit, and after an hour, Maria's sister left. 2 hours later, the murders occurred. This is an outline of the Hinterkaifeck farm. It is assumed somehow, whoever the murderer was, he was able to lure the members of the family one by one from the living room to the barn, where they would be killed using a mattock, which is a tool that's similar to a pickaxe. After killing Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, and younger Cecilia one by one, the murderer would then move into the house, where he killed young Joseph in his crib and the new maid Maria Baumgartner while she was asleep. What's odd is, after March 31st, or the day of the murders, there was still activity on the farm. Animals were being fed, and some neighbors saw smoke coming out of the chimney of the Hinterkaifeck farm. This could mean only one thing. In the days between the murders taking place and the bodies being discovered, whoever committed the murders was living in the house. The day after the murder, the younger Cecilia was reported absent from her school. Also, around that same time was when coffee sellers knocked on the door, but left after getting no response. Later that day, one of the neighbors to the Hinterkaifeck farm, a man named Michael Plockel, that's some yeet shit, passed by the farm when he saw smoke coming out the chimney. Finally, the most chilling report was that of Albert Hoffner. Albert was a mechanic who had showed up to fix a broken engine on the Hinterkaifeck farm. When he showed up for the repairs though, he heard no noises inside the house, and waited outside for the Grubers to return back to their property so he could tell them that he was going to go in and work on their engine. But after an hour of waiting, he decided to just go in on his own and fix the engine. He went around the house and entered through the back door into the machine room. He worked on the engine for 4 hours until he finally finished and left. That means the entire 5 hours he spent both waiting outside and inside the house, both the bodies of the family and even the killer were in the house with him. On his way out, Albert spoke to another neighbor of the Gruber family, a man named Lorenz Schlittenbauer. He told him how the Hinterkaifeck farm was empty for the 5 hours he was there. Lorenz found this a little worrying, so he sent over his sons over to the Hinterkaifeck farm to check in on the Grubers, and after 4 days, the horrific scene on Hinterkaifeck was finally discovered. Now it's important to remember this whole situation happened in 1922, back when DNA analysis, fingerprinting, or ballistics experts didn't even exist or were rudimentary at best. On top of that, so much dumb stuff happened directly after the bodies were discovered. Like, apparently, most of the villagers stopped by to look at the murder before police were even able to get there, which completely contaminated the entire crime scene. Another reason for so much information being lost is this murder happened in what 20 years later would become the epicenter of the largest war in history, which means a lot of documentation for exact details got carpet bombed out of existence. Police reports, autopsy documents, and even all 6 of the victims' heads all went missing sometime between these murders and today. In fact, the exact order of the events is not even agreed on. What I laid out is a composite of many different variations I've heard. Okay, now with that, let's get into the investigation and the suspects. Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Now, what makes him a suspect? Well, aside from the obvious reason that Lorenz was a neighbor of the Gruber family and so was in close proximity to the murders, there is another reason. Victoria's husband, whose name was Karl Gabriel, died in World War I, but Joseph was born in 1920, which is a whole 2 years after the end of World War I and 6 years after Karl's death. How would that be possible? Well, the answer is Lorenz Schlittenbauer was the true father of Joseph, or at least that's the obvious assumption. Well, what's the proof for Lorenz being the father of Joseph? Lorenz was a married man, but his wife passed away in 1918, which would mean he was single and ready to mingle at the time. Victoria had also lost her husband, so it would make sense. There was also court records of Schlittenbauer and Victoria fighting over whether Lorenz should have to pay alimony for Joseph. And so the motive for him being the murderer was that he wouldn't have to pay alimony for Joseph. Then there's the suspicious actions he took the day of the murder. Apparently, after being informed of the murders by his son, he was witnessed by 2 neighbors presenting a key to the house and opening the locked door. Then he went inside alone before anyone else. It's also thought he was probably one of the people that moved around the bodies before the police were able to get onto the scene, which means he definitely disturbed the crime scene and probably hindered the investigation. So overall, there is a lot of evidence that will lead you to believe Lorenz is the guy, but this theory is not without its issues. For example, even though there is technically a motive for Lorenz, why would he kill an entire family over alimony payments? Risking getting caught for killing a family, all to not pay a percentage of your income for your child, just doesn't really make that much sense. And even though Lorenz Schlittenbauer did go into the house himself before any of the other neighbors, he had literally 4 entire days to mess up the investigation. Cause remember, whoever the murderer was, he stayed in the house for a long time after he committed his acts. So even if he was the killer, there really isn't a good argument against him. Finally, if Schlittenbauer truly was the killer, that would mean he would have to maintain the Hinterkaifeck farm for there to be activity after the murders, then go back to his own house and maintain his own farm, and still be able to go to community events like church, all while not drawing suspicion to himself. Overall, it just seems way too implausible for him to be the killer. Another suspect often brought up is Karl Gabriel. And with Karl, there's definitely a motive, because his wife cheated on him with some old guy around the block and gave birth to an illegitimate son in his eyes. I mean, most cases of female homicide happen with an intimate partner being the killer, so who's to say a desensitized war veteran wouldn't carry this out? Pretty convincing, right? Well, except for the part where Karl Gabriel died 6 years before any of this happened. Yeah, this entire theory hinges on the fact that Karl Gabriel somehow magically survived the shell attack which killed him in France, which multiple of his comrades accounted happening, then did fuck all for the next 6 years, including the 2 years after the war ended, only for him to come back and kill his entire family, and then vanish off the face of the earth again. Yeah, I'm not buying it. Andreas Gruber. Andreas Gruber is the grandfather of the family, so why would he be the murderer? Well, because Andreas already had a past of abusing his family. 7 years before the murders of 1915, Andreas Gruber was charged by the court of law for having an incestuous relationship with his daughter Victoria, and he served a year in prison for this. Victoria also ended up serving time in prison for getting raped. I don't really get the thought process for giving her prison time, but whatever. Anyway, given his background of abusing Victoria, it could mean that Joseph, the youngest member of the family, could have been both the grandson and the son of Andreas. While a dude's nuts are usually out of commission by 40, there's definitely cases of men being upwards of 90 years old and still having children. So biologically speaking, Andreas could have definitely been the father of Joseph. On top of that, the fact that so many suspicious things were happening around the farm without him reporting the actions to the police make a strong case against him. What if Andreas was trying to hide something? All in all, this makes Andreas look pretty suspicious. He definitely has a strong history of already abusing his family. And then there was the way that the family was actually killed. Remember, the people in the family made their way into the barn one by one to get killed. And you're way more likely to go into a room alone with someone if it's a familiar face, as opposed to a random person. Boom, there we have it. I, Adee, have figured it out. And Andreas is the real killer. Oh, yeah, Andreas died along with the rest of the Gruber family. And he couldn't have committed suicide because the murder weapon was hidden away in the attic. So unless he was able to give himself a fatal blow, still be conscious enough to hide away his weapon in the attic without leaving a blood trail, and then crawl back to die with the rest of the family, he could not have been the killer. In 2007, students in a German police academy were asked to try to solve this case with modern technology. They came to the conclusion that given all the lost documents, missing pieces of evidence, and witness/suspects that are now dead, there probably never will be an answer to this case. There were two things that the students were sure about this crime though. The murders were personal and done with passion, and that was the Hinterkaifeck murders. I would appreciate if you subscribed and liked. Also, I'm live every weekend on this YouTube channel, so check that out. Okay, bye.